Hello, everybody, and welcome to another Restrung podcast. I'm your host, Sander Vika, and for those of you who haven't joined us on the show before, I am your really average club player turned tennis podcaster. And together here at Restrung, we aim to bring you tennis content, particularly for those who love the sport as much as we do. This may have gone a bit under the radar, as it seemed to be quite quiet in a lot of ways, and really between the ATP Cup and the Australian Open, Milos Raonic, the tall Canadian player who played for, well, around 15 years or so on the tour, announced his retirement. He hasn't played in a little while. Really, the last time he played was at the Olympics in Paris in 2024, then pulled out of subsequent tournaments with a shoulder injury, and then has kind of gone under the radar since. And this is one of these stories really that is really quite interesting, and it highlights something quite interesting as well about not just the sport, but tennis fans, and I guess in a lot of ways sports fans themselves, because Milos Raonic, although getting some props from Novak Djokovic and obviously Felix Auger-Aliassime, very quiet in terms of the recognition that he got. Some other names who shared messages or at least comments on social media to Raunic's post were John Isner, Bianca Andreescu, and Zizou Bergs. But really interesting when you have really a giant of the sport who won 8 tour level titles, and not just that, but he was world number 3 back in 2016, and beyond that as well. He spent 5 years or so inside the top 15, and it kind of shows where things are at in terms of, how we look at these careers and how we look at players, and how, we talked about it, and you hear a lot of other people talk about it. Andy Roddick being one of them, one of those champions, because he knows exactly what it's like. But you have these players, these incredible players like Raonic, like Zverev, like Roddick, like Thomas Burdick, like David Ferrer. The list goes on. Kei Nishikori. Just the list can go on. And because you have these superhuman generational talents that keep seemingly popping up and really distancing themselves from the rest of the pack. Obviously it was the big 3 for pretty much 20 years. Now it's Sinner and Alcaraz. It really quite distorts everything else underneath them. In the current crop of players at the moment, if we just simply look at the rankings at the moment, underneath the top 3 of Alcaraz, Sinner, Djokovic, you have Zverev, you have Musetti, you have Felix Auger-Aliassime, you have Taylor Fritz, you have Alex de Minaur, Ben Shelton. I mean, just incredible talents. And it's quite sad because the one stat really that they're judged on is the fact that they have no Grand Slams between them. And it really shows about how blessed the tennis fan universe, as it were, has become, because you have these generational talents that are so dominant and so brilliant. It distorts everything else, and in a lot of ways you can argue for and against it, but is it that positive? And the reason why we highlight this is because if you look around, it's just career stats. The number 3 in the world, right, made the Wimbledon final in 2016, made 4 ATP Masters 1000 finals, won 8 ATP titles, 383 wins, and is 9th all time in aces with more or less 8,500. You look at, he won 91% of his service games. 91%. When you compare that to some of the best players the sport has ever seen, Federer under that with 89%, Djokovic under that with 86%. You get to Rafa Nadal, never won really for his serve, but it did get very good as his career went on, 85% of service games won. We look at perhaps the best serve tennis has ever seen. John Isner, 92%. And just to look at things as well, Grand Slam winner, ex-world number one, Andy Roddick, just an insane serve, especially at that time. 90% of his service games won. That's special. That's beyond special, really, if you think about it. Raonic, one of these players that really was one of the first of these very tall players. He was almost like the first generation, really, of these extremely tall players. 6'5" ish, 6'6", just fit under a door. And in comparison to today's very tall players, absolutely not on the same level with the movement, with the agility. If you look at Sasha Zverev, if you look at Daniil Medvedev, those types of players. However, very much a part of that first very tall crop of players, the Thomas Burdicks, the Juan Martín del Potros, the John Isners. And in a lot of ways, those were the guys who shaped and paved the way for the next crop of taller guys. Because you could even see it with guys like Marin Cilic before the likes of Zverev, the Medvedevs, and the likes. So we just wanted to take a moment here on the Restrung podcast to really celebrate and honor and really give Milos that send-off that he deserves. Because when you look at his numbers, again, the guy beat most of the players out there. Again, he was in the top 15 in the world for 5 years straight. You don't do that just on a serve, just by being tall. When you look at his least favorite surface, which was clay, he still won 88% of his service games. He still saved more than 2 out of every 3 break points, and he still converted over 1 in 3 of his break point chances. Now, if you look at his most favorite surface, which arguably is grass, he won 94% of his service games. 94%. That means if he was winning in straight sets in a Grand Slam, it's just insane. If you think that you only lose 5 games, 5 of your 100 service games, and you think roughly, unless you're playing 5-set matches regularly over that fortnight, you're only losing your serve 5 times over the course of that is up there with the most elite players. And that takes into consideration all of his years. And what also makes that particularly impressive is that Milos was very much in the mid-teens or so over his career, even on his favorite surface. Return points won. Those big levers, very, very easy, particularly with that first generation of big players, to jam them up, to get short replies on your serve. And if they didn't strike that first critical blow, particularly against the Federers, the Nadals, the Djokovic's, it was very difficult for them to come back. And that essentially highlights the difference across between 70 and 100 matches a year. It's those little things that often decide these matches. For Raonic, a single loose service game, a single point in a tiebreaker, a dip in first serve percentage, or one extended rally at the wrong time. But again, it's another player that, as with many players, what could he have achieved without injury? Repeated issues, particularly in the kind of the lower half of his body, his legs, hamstrings, calf, foot, shoulder. Could he have won a 1,000? Could he have, on his day, won a Wimbledon? Again, these are the things that we ask ourselves, especially because he was right there. 2013, his real breakthrough year, you felt, in his home Canadian Masters 1000 in Montreal, but obviously ran into Nadal during one of his more impressive hard court swings in 2013. And if you remember some of those very tight matches, I remember the particularly tight couple of matches that he had in the 2016 World Tour Finals, the semifinal, that very much could have paved the way to success beyond what he'd had at that point in perhaps his best year of his career. And that's why it's important to remember. Because for a lot of these champions, these players that were so close to becoming the players that ultimately Murray and Wawrinka and Dominic Thiem and Marin Cilic who were able to, on their day, fight past the legends of the sport to claim the biggest titles. Milos Raonic stood for something even greater, and that was the precursor to a new and the next generation of player that now wins those big titles on a regular basis. The likes of Daniel Medvedev, the likes of Sasha Zverev, who ultimately did win the World Tour Finals, who won the US Open, and continue to strive for bigger things. And that's where we'll leave it. So we thank you, Milos, for the memories and the tennis that you provided us over the years. Also appreciate what you symbolize for now the ever-increasing number of taller tennis players at the very top of the game. It's been Sander Vika. You've been listening to Restrung. We'll catch you next time for another podcast. Thanks for listening.